Industrial development is of critical importance for sustained and inclusive economic growth in African countries. South African President and African Union Chairperson Cyril Ramaphosa addressed a recent session of the African Union Summit on the African Continental Free Trade Area. He noted that the commencement of trading under this Free Trade Area Treaty on the 1st of January 2021 will boost industrialization.
Our treaty will boost intra-African trade. It will promote industrialization and competitiveness and contribute to job creation.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenya, and a big welcome to this week's edition of Africa Today, which is focusing on the challenges of industrialization in Africa. In the second part of our show, we are asking and we are analyzing the failure by West African countries to launch their eco-common currency as planned in 2020. We are asking, is France sabotaging efforts to dump the CFA-Franc in West Africa? And don't forget to send us your comments as you watch our program and let us know what you think.
Africa's industrialization challenges. Despite being the second most populated continent in the world, with a population of 1.2 billion people, Africa represented only 1.4% of the world manufacturing value added in the first quarter of 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the situation, and this has impacted negatively on the industrial sector. Economic growth expected to fall to minus 3.3% in 2020 in sub-Saharan Africa, pushing the region into its first recession in 25 years.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought about disruption to global supply chains and forced a rethink of local manufacturing capability. This has created an opportunity for the African continent, particularly now that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will be coming into effect from January. Speaking at an African Free Trade Agreement business forum in Kigali, Rwandan president said the agreement is expected to spur manufacturing in the continent.
This agreement is about trade in goods and services. These are the kinds of complex products that drive high-income economies. African workers adding value in Africa, services offered by African professionals using the latest technologies, manufactured goods that are made in Africa.
Now, the path towards industrialization in Africa, however, faces a myriad of challenges. To discuss this, we are joined by Joseph Ochieno, a writer and an African affairs analyst. Thanks a lot for your time, Mr. Ochieno. Now, why has Africa failed to industrialize despite being the source of a huge chunk of raw materials used in industrialized countries?
I think there are very many reasons, but mostly historical. I think Africa's challenge goes back to perhaps centuries, considering that with the huge amount of resources that we do have, and we have always had over centuries, we're literally enslaved, and so therefore controlled over centuries. So we became the source for raw materials, and our people were never ever allowed to participate in the day-to-day management of their own affairs. In fact, until not so long ago, we could not even become independent nation states. In a way, that's one. But number two, I think much more recently, no huge excuse, the challenge has been leadership in Africa.
Mr. Ochieno there says that leadership is crucial if Africa is to industrialize. Well, Rwanda seems to be providing some leadership. This East African country banned second-hand clothes imports, mainly from the United States, in 2018. The ban was aimed at boosting its textile industry. Now, as a result, the U.S. ended Rwanda duty-free export privileges. Rwanda has insisted that the move to ban imports of second-hand clothes from the United States is meant to boost local industries.
We want to achieve two goals in the country. One of them is to really support the local producers because they're there. We're not just opening up the market for them to do business. We also want to understand how we can make them competitive.
Mr. Ochieno, how have imports from Western countries been a major impediment to the development of African industries?
In the presence of decent and responsible governments, that should be regulated, and most regulations normally would be either through taxations or even like conditional development.
Mr. Otieno, you have spoken there about the need for proper government policies to stop unregulated imports from industrialized nations. Now, do you think lack of political commitment and the audacity to implement the right policies is an impediment to Africa's quest for industrialization?
Politics determines, the trends around the world, whether it's in industry, in service, in security, and in everything else. I think, as far as Africa is concerned, there will have to be a nuanced and substantial change in terms of the political values on the continent. And unless and until we have and begin to have leaders who are not only democratically elected, but those that are accountable to the people, and those who know that after 4 or indeed 5 years of their term, whichever whether it's first or second terms, they will be subjected to a critical rigor of their programs over that period of time. And so therefore, they will have to present what my late president used to call the balance sheet to the citizenry. We will continue this way. So political will is lacking in many cases.
Well, Mr. Otieno there believes that the lack of political will is a barrier in Africa's quest for industrialization. However, some countries have shown political will.
Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, is successfully implementing the One District, One Factory program. The aim is to change the nature of Ghana's economy from one which is dependent on import and export of raw material to one which is focused on manufacturing, value addition, and export of processed goods.
In partnership with the private sector, we'll establish one factory in each of the 216 districts across the country. One district, one factory.
A technology-savvy educated workforce is more important than ever in today's fourth industrial revolution. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame believes that quality education systems in Africa, especially in secondary schools, are critical for the continent's long-term development goals.
Africa's path to prosperity will be defined by the quality of our schools. And secondary school is the critical link that prepares young people to succeed in the workplace. This report sets out some key principles we need to take on board to adapt our secondary education systems for the future. Digital literacy, science, and technology have to be absolutely central because the world of work is going to continue to change in unpredictable ways.
Do African countries have enough technical know-how to effectively enter the fourth industrial revolution?
I think that's a very interesting question. As an African who believes that I have got sufficient capacity to think, and who's generally surrounded by not so uneducated Africans, I actually think, by and large, we've got the capacity to be able to do so. And again, as an African who travels across the continent and indeed the rest of the world, particularly in Western Europe and North America, I know Africans with huge capacity to compete at the highest levels. I think that is possibly not the issue. The issue is whether or not today our educational systems on the continent are geared sufficiently enough to train and to capacitate and to equip the young Africans, particularly the young graduates on the African continent, and the next sets of skills in terms of equipping post-educational post, if you like, initial trainings with sufficient skills to compete in the global market. I think that part of it is a problem. The other thing, though, is that if we're talking, as we were saying much earlier, Chinese investments and many others in terms of Western investments, you realize that many of these guys come with some of their own already substantially skilled at the top end of skills management. And in this case, therefore, you find that the African is generally very much confined.
Very well put there. Africans have the capacity to compete at the highest technical levels. Mr. Otieno, At the start of our show, we heard about the African Continental Free Trade Area. How will this trade bloc boost industrial development in Africa?
Already, cross-border trade, in a very simplistic way, tends to be quite huge because many of these cases about communities, even today, in my previous assignment and conversations and commitments, I was having conversations with people some of whom were having engagements from across the borders, more than a single border, in fact. So that is possible. The problem, though, is the volume of that trade. Other than the informal element of the trade, the volume of the formal trades where you still find African countries subjecting their neighbors, in fact, in many cases, sister nations, to huge level of taxations, and there is still a huge amount of living impediments that, you go to a neighboring country and forget about trade. You simply find that crossing the border to a neighboring country, people queue for far longer than they would possibly try to seek for visas going to some of the established nations. I think there's still a huge problem.
Well, a lot more needs to be done in terms of putting the right policies in place for African countries to effectively compete globally.
Where is West Africa's eco currency?
The decision by 8 mainly Francophone West African countries to abandon the CFA currency that they have been using since before their independence from France was touted as the end of French stranglehold on the region.
At the end of 2019, Emmanuel Macron announced that France wanted a reform of the CFA-Franc, two currencies, the West African CFA-Franc used in 8 West African countries and the Central African CFA-Franc used in 6 Central African countries. According to the current arrangement, these countries must deposit 50% of their respective foreign exchange reserves to the French Finance Ministry. Chiefs of the 15-nation Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS regional bloc, said in 2019 the CFA-Franc will be replaced with the ECO in 2020. However, hopes to launch eco-currency have faded amid the coronavirus crisis and squabbling over severing the remaining monetary ties with the former colonial ruler, France. Speaking in June, Nigerian president cautioned his counterparts in ECOWAS bloc of possible dangers brought by ECO if not well thought out.
We cannot ridicule ourselves by entering a union to disintegrate potentially no sooner than we enter into it. We need to be clear and unequivocal about our position regarding this process. We must also communicate same to the outside world effectively. We have all staked so much in this project to leave things to mere expediencies and convenience.
Now, to get some insight on why the eco-currency failed to take off as expected, we have contacted Daniel Lazar, journalist and political analyst. It's good to have you with us, Mr. Lazar. Now, can you tell us, what's your take on the failure by West African countries to establish the eco-currency in 2020 as previously agreed?
There are a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, these economies are very weak, and they're getting weaker due to the global recession since the pandemic hit. And so in the European common market, those countries grew together during a time of unprecedented economic boom. But what we see in Africa, in Central and West Africa, is the exact opposite. I mean, a deepening recession, and as the recession strikes, forces of disunity grow stronger. So therefore, the likelihood of them coming together behind some kind of common market and a common currency seem to be diminishing. So there's still a lot of talk, but the talk seems to be going nowhere.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Lazar, for that.
Despite statements, French President Emmanuel Macron appears not interested in ending the unequal and unfair relationship with countries that were colonized by his country in Africa. France continues to control the trade and currency of these former colonies. The maintenance of economic domination allows the prolongation of political domination. Is France involved in behind-the-scene moves to prevent West African countries from having a new currency not tied to Paris?
I think France probably wants to maintain the CFA-Franc because in general it wants to keep a hand in those countries' internal affairs. But the war on terror, the international intervention in Libya has harmed those, which France supported, of course, has harmed those countries immensely. I mean, the overthrow of Gaddafi in 2011 led to a huge spread of Libyan arms throughout the region, and helped create chaos and subvert governments, you know, in across the French-speaking area. So France's policies, not only its currency policies, but its broader policies in support of in the global war on terror, have just wreaked enormous damage, have imposed enormous damage on those countries.
Mr. Lazar there has pointed out that French policies have imposed damage on CFA-Franc zone countries. By the way, the lowest ranking countries in the 2019 UNDP Human Development Index, namely Chad, the Central African Republic and Niger, are in the CFA-Franc zone. Clearly, reliance on France comes with a heavy price for these resource-rich countries. Mr. Lazar, why do governments in this region lack political resolve to disentangle their nations from French monetary imperialism?
Well, I'm just skeptical of any attempt to put all the blame on the currency question. I mean, I think that the currency issue is part of the problem, but the bigger problem is French foreign policy in general, the war on terror, which has actually led to more terror, more weapons, and more terror throughout the region, and the weak economies in Central and West Africa, and therefore the growing forces of disunion.
Thanks a lot for that, Mr. Lazar.
Money is an instrument of sovereignty for a state, But even 60 years after independence, the former colonies of France in Central and West Africa did not have it. Will a delay in rolling out the eco-currency negatively impact on the economies of these African countries?
They've been talking about an eco for years, the African equivalent of the euro. But the preconditions don't exist, and those preconditions involve strong local economies and some kind of tendency to greater political union. And we just haven't seen that. I mean, first of all, the eco region is divided by language between French and English, and that creates growing problems. And secondly, the countries, while they talk about unity, all their actions are in the opposite direction. So the basis for a common ecozone that would be analogous to the eurozone in the EU, I mean, just don't exist. And you can't regard currency as a kind of a magic wand or an electric switch that you can flick on and off. You have to have years of political foundation laying before that is even possible.
While some countries in West Africa have expressed reservations on the single currency in the region, in June, Gambia President Adama Barrow addressed his colleagues in a virtual meeting. He said his country remains committed to the revised roadmap of the ECOWAS Monetary Cooperation Program.
I will emphasize here that the Gambia remains committed to the revised roadmap of the ECOWAS Monetary Cooperation Program. This commitment has been translated into sustained improvements on achieving the set of macroeconomic convergence criteria. Since 2017, the Gambia has constantly achieved 3 of the 4 primary convergence criteria, missing only the budget deficit criterion.
What needs to be done to speed up the establishment of the eco-currency?
I mean, when you saw the establishment of a common market in Europe in 1948, I believe it was, the economies were growing, the countries were coming together in a new burst of democracy in the wake of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Strong democratic institutions were being developed, and those all came together to form a European common market, which eventually grew into the EU and the Eurozone. So you just can't turn these processes on and off like with a flick of a switch. You've got to lay a strong political foundation, and that's not happening. That would require a huge change in political circumstances in Central and West Africa. It would require basically a democratic revolution, and that simply is not taking place.
A strong political foundation is a prerequisite for a powerful monetary union in West Africa. That's Mr. Lazar's take on the path West African nations need to take if they are to achieve dreams of a common currency. Now that wraps it up for this edition of Africa Today. Thanks a lot for watching, and we look forward to your comments and suggestions on what you would like to see covered here at Africa Today. On behalf of the entire Africa Today team, I would like to thank you all for watching. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, and God bless you.